So as Gabriele said, I was the executive director of the Scala Center until about a week ago, or a little over a week ago. I am no longer the executive director of the Scala Center. I'm now at Carnegie Mellon University in the US, so that also explains my fun jet lag. And if you don't know Carnegie Mellon, it's a university in Pennsylvania. And they're a big computer science school. They do lots of programming languages stuff. They do robotics. They do all kinds of things. It's a cool place if you're ever interested in, weird, cool computer science research. I recommend looking at the stuff that this university does because they're awesome. And I just started a new lab there called the Composable Systems Lab, which is all about bringing together, ideas from programming languages to sort of distributed systems and trying to give people more guarantees in your distributed systems. So it would be really nice if you could compose components, right, for putting together distributed systems. Like, hey, let's compose microservices. Wouldn't that be cool? So that's the kind of stuff that we do there. We actually have a really cool group of people that just joined with me. So I think lots of people know Chris Mickeljohn. He is very active in the Erlang world, also doing distributed system stuff. And if you've ever heard of Papers We Love, that's Zishan Lakhani's baby. And he's kind of the guy who behind the Papers We Love conference. And he works on networks and programming languages. And Kevin Clancy does work related to proving things about consistency in type systems. So these are the folks that I've started this lab with, just so you know. These are the cool people I work with now. And the new director of the Scala Center, the new boss lady, is Sebastian Doren. So if you're familiar with Scala.js, yeah. Sebastian just finished his PhD on Monday. That's also, you guys should be clapping for that. That's huge. And now he takes over the helm of the Scala Center, which I'm really excited about. But to go back a few slides, the title of my talk, it's called Programming Language. A programming language is its community. And I will give you a little bit more insight about what I mean by that in a moment. But first, I guess I would ask you to tell me what you think an open source community is. There's a lot of people, I discovered that nobody knows. If you ask somebody, they're like, I don't know. People giving free code, Does anybody have an answer about what is this? What is an open source community? Maybe this is, maybe this is obvious to most people in this room, but until recently it wasn't obvious to me. Can somebody at least acknowledge? Yes, hello. There's this very unfamiliar face here named, whom I don't think this one knows anything about open source, but no, just kidding. That's a perfect definition, and the word vague, the word vague came up many times. Actually, I have a very similar definition. Look, a loosely organized global community of contributors who share some kind of common interest. If you talk about the Scala community, that common interest happens to be Scala and often functional programming. But it doesn't have to be, I guess. In general, when we talk about the Scala community, we just mean Scala. And we tend to assemble around the artifacts that our community we create or work on or use. Let's take a step back and look at that. The first thing that we see here is that it's a group of people, and then there's an artifact of us, which is software. If we want to sort of zoom in a little bit more on that, what it means for the Scala community, it means that we're a loosely organized global community of people who use and work on libraries, tools, DSLs, and more in Scala, usually. But yeah, again, the first thing that pops up in this sentence is people. Does anybody know of this guy called Leo Myrovich? Yep, hey, of course, Paulo knows. He's a guy who founded a company called Graphistry. He got his PhD from UC Berkeley. But what I want to talk to you about that he did in the past, he co-authored a paper in 2013 that became the best paper of Uppsala that year, which is a big programming languages conference in academia, which was empirically studying programming language adoption, so how do programming languages get adopted. And I encourage you to read it. It's a really fun and easy to read paper. It's got lots of graphs about things that people have said and surveys and just different ways of reaching out and talking to people. But what he did was he looked at 10 years of repository metadata, which tracks almost 600,000 open source projects. Hilariously, you guys think it's funny probably, but it was all on SourceForge because GitHub hasn't been around as long as SourceForge has, so you have more history in SourceForge. And then he did a number of surveys ranging, each survey ranged from 1,000 to 13,000 respondents. And so, it was a bunch of data that he had, and what he wanted to ask from all of this data was, well, how do programming languages get adopted by groups of people? So which factors of the programming, or which factors in all of this are what causes people to go with a programming language? And these are the results from his study. So these are the different factors when picking a programming language. And the different color bars mean basically he separated the results out between large organizations and not large organizations. So the overall answer is in green. And then small companies are the light gray and large companies are the dark gray. And as you can see, there's a little bit difference between sort of what's the most important thing to large companies versus small companies, but in general, the trend is the same, which is that, and this is just kind of ranked in terms of like what was the thing that came up the most as being the most important. The most important thing by far was open source libraries. So if there was an ecosystem of open source libraries available, people would then go for switching to that language because all of these libraries existed. And then, the ability to extend existing code. People, do they already use it? Do they have personal familiarity? Do they have team familiarity? And then other things that you would expect to be sort of the main reasons that somebody would adopt a programming language is kind of at the very end. So some particular language feature, safety, correctness. Sorry, we all complain all the time about the lack of tooling support or that there could be better tools for Scala. However, weirdly enough, it's not in the top of the list. I still think tools are super, super important. However, according to this data, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is actually sort of a healthy community of open source libraries being made available that people can use. And again, if we go back, how do we get those open source libraries? Well, we have this loosely organized global community of people who make those things happen accidentally as an artifact of their existence. So that's interesting. Just to give you a few quotes from the paper, because they say it better than I can. Through multiple surveys, we saw that developers value open source libraries as the dominant factor in choosing programming languages. Social factors, not tied to intrinsic language features, such as existing personal or team experience, also rate highly. So personal things, not intrinsic features of the language, like how familiar are you or your team with this language, is more important than the actual features of the language. And so this is also kind of a quick summary of these results, and also a little bit more information than that graph completely shows. I can't obviously give you a full summary of the paper in just a few minutes, but the main observation here is that sort of the things that are largely social become more important in sort of the adoption of the language. Another thing that is important, which I didn't emphasize, is that the size of the company matters. So as you can see, the ability to extend existing code and whether or not something's already used in a certain group obviously rates more highly in large organizations than it does in small organizations. So that's interesting to note. But really the bottom line here is a programming language is actually its community, I would argue. Obviously this is one paper, and this is just like, one guy did a bunch of surveys, collected a bunch of data, but I don't think that a lot of people would find this such a ridiculous statement, because, especially people who work in open source, because it's the group of people that create all of these open source libraries that then all of our companies and other things in turn depend on that make a programming language successful or not. So I would argue, maybe to qualify this a little bit better, more precisely, a programming language's success is attributed to its community and not the other way around. So what about Scala? We have this cool little tool called scala-italy, which lets us see at least what exists in the Scala community out there in terms of libraries. I pulled some statistics back in June. So if you look at scala-italy, there exists 5,800 projects, probably a little more by now. And of those different projects, we have almost 300,000 individual releases, which is pretty cool. That sounds like a good number, right? But we're nowhere near other languages like Python, which has over 100,000 projects and almost 1 million different releases. So we're still small compared to languages like Python. And I guess, if I can make any point about that, is that, as a community and as a programming language, we can't forget that we're still pretty small. And we're kind of like, in the adolescent years, I would argue, of programming language sort of growth and development. And as a result, I think the Scala community is also kind of like in its awkward teenager phase where we're sort of, okay, we have a community now, let's continue to grow it and let's try to, make it grow up big and healthy. Yeah, and as a community, we also need to be aware that we're sort of in the earlier stages, I think, of our growth as a programming language community, and we, typically are not aware of these things, right? As we're when we're in it. So this is maybe one takeaway, is that we need to be aware that we're a bunch of weird, awkward teenagers now as a community, and we should try together to do whatever we can to help sort of the growing pains as a growing community. And one thing that I think is rather important to always point out, even, I think others have pointed it out, as a community we should always strive to be on the same page, which means, rather than working in silos and making individual competing factions, we should all, since we're a small, weird, little awkward teenager community, we should maybe strive to work together a little bit more than against each other. I know this is super vague, but if you feel like that other Scala person is doing the wrong thing and, I don't want to talk to them for that reason, you're doing the wrong thing probably. You should probably not be doing that because there's not that many Scala developers out there. We're a small community, do not be drawing lines between one another is my point. We're trying to tear down some of these walls. So, we are doing random things to try and do this. Hopefully some of it helps. In May, we did a contributor summit. We're trying to bring together the various people who work on the language, the tools, the libraries, the things that are important. And I can't say that we, did anything conclusively amazing during this period of time. I think we just understand each other slightly better, perhaps, hopefully, or at least we have a face now to attach to the person who's making comments in an issue or something like this. And I'd like to continue doing things like this. We also do these Scala sprees. Can you raise your hand if you know what a Scala spree is? Cool. So not many people, some of you do. That's awesome. I get to tell you now. I think it's neat. So it's a community building exercise that we started in the last 2 years or so. The idea is to have a structure and a process for bringing together people to work on just any sort of Scala open source project. And the structure is as follows. You have a library author in the room. That library author will curate, 3, 5, a handful of to-dos, things that are able to be accomplished within 3 or so hours by newcomers. And the idea is that, with the library author in the room and with some curated issues that somebody can work on and sort of a time limit to this event, they have been different durations, but, let's just say 4 hours or something like this, like workshop length, 3 hours. And the goal for the participants who show up is to meet one of several open source, the authors of open source projects or contributors to open source projects, and to get one PR merged by the end of the spree. And if you manage to do that, we give you this cool T-shirt that says Scala contributor on the back, and it's really neat, and people seem to like it. It's fun. We're trying to make this a little bit more generalizable because it seems that at least, it seems to be working. I'm not going to say that, oh yeah, because of this, there are umpteen pull requests and so many new contributors of whatever. It's just, a lot of us get the sense that, we know each other a little bit better now. We have found new contributors to our projects via these things, and we'd like them to continue, and we're trying to generalize it beyond Scala. So it's a general recipe that we'll post soon for other languages and whatnot to follow. And other things that we do at the Scala Center, just to point out a few more things. We try to make the Scala community, or sort of like the main Scala channels, a sort of a central place for people to communicate and collaborate. And we want basically to, this is another cool thing that's coming up. You're going to see more about it in the next few months. we're trying to make Scala days accessible to the community too. So in the last few months, it seems that we have taken over for 2019 the majority of the organizing at the Scala Center for Scala Days in 2019. And it's going to be in Lausanne in Switzerland, and it's not going to be ridiculously expensive, by the way. So that's awesome, yeah. So it's going back home to Switzerland, and Martin is very excited about this. I can't tell you exactly what the prices are going to be for the tickets, but it's going to be, I would guess, I'm gonna give you a number. I'm gonna guess it's going to be probably for the 3-day thing. It's going to be probably $500, $600, which is significantly cheaper than it has been in the past. It's not super cheap yet, and we're going to try and figure out ways to, if you're not being supported by a company, to make it much more affordable. If a company is sending you, then we're going to keep, regular sort of registration prices, but if you're paying for it yourself, we're going to bring down the prices. So things like that to try and make these things more accessible. And if there's anything else that you think that the Scala Center should be doing, there's a bunch of channels that we would like you to use. My favorite is carrier pigeons and smoke signals. But Daria Jovanovic is the one who is monitoring for carrier pigeons and smoke signals in case you choose to use these modes of communication. But this is Daria. You'll probably, if you keep an eye on the various mailing lists or on Twitter or whatever, or you show up at some Scala spree or whatever, she's going to be very loud, and you're not going to be able to miss her. So I'm sure you're going to see her eventually. So before I get into some of the data points that I actually wanted to tell you, I want to first remind you that Scala, again, like I made this point earlier. It's not the most scientific point, but I hope it's a point that you hold on to, is that Scala is only as strong as its community, and you are Scala's community. Whether or not you're giving back to an open source project or not, you're using it at your company, you still are a part of our happy little community. So given that, are you ready to be horrified? because I have some data points. I've been sort of collecting these data points for a while now, and I realized that a lot of people, despite the fact that I've been sharing them readily, people haven't seen them. So I'm going to share them one more time. So this is sort of, the rest of the talk is about some things that I have sort of collected about the health of, in general, open source right now in 2018. It's a little bit related to Scala. I would say the things I'm going to show you, I don't think it's as bad in Scala as it is for some of the other things that you're going to see. But it is still not a great situation, and if you're building your business on a lot of open source projects, you should be aware of these things. So, more riddles, because you guys are way too quiet right now. What does this sidewalk have to do with Scala? Somebody's got to give me, come on, this has got to be easy. Or you can change it to this zebra crossing thing, or maybe the more obvious example might be a bridge. Somebody's got to have an answer. Yes, it's true. It's infrastructure. It's a thing that sort of we all, use to connect us, or that we build on every day, like that we need this to sort of operate in our day-to-day life. These are all examples of shared physical infrastructure, and anybody can use these things. Like you can come from some other country and use a bridge in Italy. Nobody's going to be upset if you use a bridge, right? You're totally allowed to do that. The same thing is true for digital infrastructure. There exists, a bunch of digital infrastructure that is shared, that we all use, that we all build on, that we all sort of spend our day-to-day lives sort of depending on, that we don't really think about. So just as much as you use a bridge to take your kid to school every day, you use digital infrastructure that you don't think of every day to, check the news or do anything else. And just as a qualifier, every time I say open source, I don't mean specific, in this spectrum of free, libre, open source, whatever. There's a big debate about these things. It's been raging for 20 years. I mean all of it. I don't mean one or the other thing, or specifically open source and not free libre software. So don't think I'm discriminating here. I mean all of it. And just like physical infrastructure, anybody can use these things. So, these are all examples of open source projects that people all depend on. Most of you probably depend on most of these things in this room. Maybe not all of them, but several of them. These things are just out there. We don't really think about it when we open our news app or whatever about which open source projects are making that thing run. And if, in the case of physical infrastructure, you've got a ginormous pothole that opens up in the middle of the road and, small children are being sort of absorbed by it, what do you do? Well, since it's the, 2018, we have a bunch of apps nowadays where you can take a picture of, the portal to hell that has opened in our highway, and maybe the government will come and patch that hole, and that, that's great. We pay taxes, we inform somebody that something happened, and somebody comes and fixes it. We always have some kind of central infrastructure, so in the case of a city, the city government will come and fix it. If you have, if it's like a federal road, the federal government will come fix it, somebody will come fix it. But in the case of digital infrastructure, we don't have anything like that. There's no like, central government I could be like, I paid my taxes, now fix my bug in Docker. No, it doesn't work. Right? So there's nobody to complain to. I mean, maybe you can fix it yourself, hopefully, if somebody will accept your patch. It's kind of a different structure. So, we all depend on this as much as we depend on bridges and things because we build our businesses on it. All of our livelihoods depend on these things. So it would be cool if there was some way to fix the gaping hole in the earth sometimes, right? So I'm going to share some data points that I think are a little horrifying, and I got a lot of the information from this wonderful report called Roads and Bridges by Nadia Egbal. So if you're horrified by some of these things and you want some more information, she's collected a lot more in this report. I've got some other data sources in the slides as well. I've got links at the bottom of the slides for where I've gotten other pieces of data. So all of this has citations essentially. But yeah, just sort of before I give you all the data points, do you remember when, it's kind of still that this is still going on, right? But I feel like this has been going on for a really long time and we still kind of do this. Do you remember when everybody was like, yeah, don't pay for things anymore, just use the open source stuff. That's the best way to do anything nowadays. And I mean, effectively what has happened is that everybody, and by everybody I mean usually companies, but beyond companies, as I'll show you, have jumped on this sort of, hey, let's use open source software as sort of the foundation for what we do and then build on top of it. And really what's happened, I think, is that, we don't actually need to encourage anybody to use open source anywhere. We actually need to, instead of being like, hey, open source is the answer, we need to say, hey, you can't get everything for free. Everybody's jumped on open source now. Nobody pays for anything anymore. This is like swung in the opposite extreme. This is a problem now. This is getting to be an issue. Instead, we need to be in, like all of this sort of like enthusiasm jumping around, being like, yeah, use open source. I think we should use that enthusiasm to encourage people to give back to it now instead. Like we have to sort of shift what we've done. To provide some data to sort of back this, I claim here, like, oh yeah, everybody's jumped on the open source bandwagon, right? So I've got some evidence of that. So there's this company called Black Duck who has been doing for, I don't know, more than 10 years now, a survey called The Future of Open Source. They've changed the name of it in 2017 for whatever reason, but they still do these surveys every year. I have some data points from the 2015 and 2016 Future of Open Source survey. So in 2015, 2016, they interviewed over 1,200 companies. So these are individual companies, not people. And of those companies in 2015, 75% of those companies indicated in their survey answers that they run their entire business on open source software. So, let's say it's approaching 80%. And this is actually up over 2x, up 2x over since 2010. So 5 years prior, I think the number was only 30-something percent of companies, like 36% of companies in 2010 said that they ran their business on open source. So I'm just giving you some numbers, like number, blah, 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 but like just kind of visualize that for a second. 5 years prior to this survey, about a third of companies were building everything on open source. That's cool. But the other, like 2/3 were paying for their infrastructure. And in 5 years, literally like everybody jumped on open source and gave up like proprietary stuff. And have you seen that number, so this is, I don't know, if there's a number of companies in the world, did we see that the same number of people jump on open source projects and like build new ones or give back to those? I don't think so. I haven't noticed that difference. So the observation here is that companies are depending more and more on open source software, and you can't see that. Like if you're just looking on the internet and following people on Twitter and commenting about tabs and spaces, there's no way for you to see this trend that has sort of emerged. And actually, they also, there's a lot more data. I'm just giving you a ridiculously high-level summary of the data from the survey, but some things that I found were interesting out of the survey. They also asked, well, why did you guys shift? Like, why is the whole universe using open source now? And the number one answer, which actually I thought was a surprise then, was the quality of solutions. So, like, it's way better to use open source software than to pay for something or build it in-house, which was also a surprise, because we like to complain about open source a lot, right? I thought that the number one reason would be the ability to customize and fix something, right? Because if you're blocked by something, you can fix it yourself and use a fork or something until that bug gets merged into whatever. But actually, that's the third reason in the list, the third ranked reason. The second ranked reason was actually competitive features and technical capabilities. So you got more features and you got sort of a better technical solution than for something that you might pay for. This is what companies were saying, which I also find surprising since we all like to complain about open source, right? And in 2015, 66% of those companies who were surveyed, they don't even consider proprietary alternatives. We need a new solution for X. What are the open source options out there? They don't look for anything they have to pay for. They just look immediately for open source. So now open source is basically becoming the default choice. In the 2017 Black Duck survey, there does not exist a 2018 one yet. They do it at like the end of the year or something, or they release the results in January the next year. So we'll see some more data in beginning of the year next year for 2018. But in 2017, 60% of the companies that they surveyed said that they've been increasing their use of open source over the last year. So it's like, okay, 80% of companies are using open source, and 60% of those 80 whatever are increasing how much they use it. So okay, good, I guess. And actually now the main reason is no vendor lock-in. That's like the number one reason in 2017, which is unsurprising. So more anecdotal evidence about sort of open source being a thing that people want to jump all over. So this is back in 2011. I'm going to give you some quotes from various startup founders. So Mark Sister was an entrepreneur in the 90s, now a venture capitalist, and he wrote an article in 2011 talking about why would anybody want to go with open source. So he says, when I built my first company starting in 1999, so this is pre-open source 1 days, it cost $2.5 million in infrastructure just to get started, and another $2.5 million in team costs to code, launch, manage, market, and sell our software. Open source became a movement, a mentality. Suddenly infrastructure was nearly free. We paid 10% of the normal cost for software, and that money was software support. It wasn't actually for the licenses or for the software in general. So, and he writes, a 90% disruption in cost spawns innovation, believe me. So suddenly it's a lot cheaper to build software, obviously, and you can build companies on that. A famous example, of course, is Instagram. I forgot what year this was. A few years ago, Mike Krieger, the co-founder of Instagram, basically wrote a blog article about giving new startup founders advice for picking technology for their startup. And he writes, well, look, you should always borrow before building yourself or paying for whenever you can. There are hundreds of fantastic open source projects that have been built through the hard experience of creating and scaling companies, especially around infrastructure and monitoring. That can save you time and let you focus on actually building out your product. Okay, cool. And Nadia, the author of the Roads and Bridges report that I put earlier in the presentation, she wrote a blog article. I'm not, again, I don't want to claim that this is truth and that everything about this is totally accurate and there's nothing wrong with it, but she has a blog article explaining that if you look at the open source software that Instagram depends on, you could attribute about $143 million of Instagram's $1 billion acquisition to the open source software that they built on. So there's a lot of value, you could argue, is being provided to this company, which gets translated into actual money when the thing gets acquired, right? But meanwhile, I don't see the same trends of increasing numbers of contributors. And there are a few famous examples. I think we all know about Heartbleed, so OpenSSL, this bug in OpenSSL back in 2014. I have a few quotes about sort of the people behind OpenSSL back in the day. And there was one, so there's two guys named Steven. So I hope not to confuse you. One is Steve Marcus, another is Stephen Henson. And Steve Marcus was a contributor to OpenSSL, but was not like the main guy behind it. He was just kind of volunteering. And he noticed that this other guy named Steven was working totally full-time in OpenSSL and was like, well, how is that possible? So he asked him, well, how do you make money? And turns out that Stephen Henson made only a fifth of Marcus's salary, and Marcus was like a government contractor. And Stephen Henson made all of his money by just like support contracts and other various things related to OpenSSL, I guess. And you know what upset Steve Marcus the most about this as well, he thought he was a strong programmer, but he was nothing like Stephen Henson. Stephen Henson was apparently, according to Steve Marcus, was some sort of wizard. And he's been working full time at OpenSSL since 1998. So this is in 2014. And so this is like, this is troubling, right? And you know, meanwhile, about 2/3 of all web servers were depending on OpenSSL. So you got this one guy who is basically like making a ridiculously low wage, working full time, keeping this thing alive, that 70% of our web servers depend on, and none of us are aware of that, which is a little horrifying. And so Steve Marcus writes, I had always assumed, as had the rest of the world, that the OpenSSL team was large, active, and well-resourced. But in reality, OpenSSL wasn't even able to support a single person's work. This is like around Heartbleed time. And I mean, if you followed that whole debacle, all of the big tech companies were like, here's millions of dollars, just their money, here's the money now. So now they're well funded. But you know, you think about 1998 to 2014, this poor guy is making, I don't know, like he's like living in poverty, keeping this thing alive that the rest of us all depend on every single day for everything. And yet, industry, government, everybody is unaware of all of the sort of funding issues behind projects we all sort of depend on. So I don't know, how many more Stephen Hensons are out there? We don't know, right? That's a little scary. So Steve Marcus was pissed, and I'm going to read his pissed off quote because, you know, I don't know, this guy seems to be very calm and collected, so when a very calm and collected person gets pissed, I listen, I guess. I'm looking at you, Fortune 1000 companies, the one who include OpenSSL in your firewall, appliance, cloud, financial security products that you sell for profit, and or who use it to secure your internal infrastructure and communications, the ones who don't have to fund an in-house team of programmers to wrangle crypto code, and who nag us for free consulting services when you can't figure out how to use it. The ones who have never lifted a finger to contribute to the open source community that gave you this gift. You know who you are. I'm like, oh man, this guy is angry. But okay, this is you know, valid points here, maybe pissed, but okay, sort of, yeah, a lot of people piggybacking on this and not really giving back in any way. And I don't know, has anybody heard of so to change topics, kind of sort of slightly, truck factor. Does anybody know about the truck factor and or bus factor? Yes, yay! Okay, this one's kind of horrifying and hilarious, but more horrifying. So the truck factor is the minimal number of developers that have to be hit by a truck or quit before a project is somehow incapacitated. And if you've contributed to an open source project or you worked on any sort of team of any kind developing software, you know that, you know, the responsibility for the code base is never equal. There's always somebody who bears a lot more brunt, or a couple of people who bear a lot more sort of responsibility than others. And it's just sort of like a natural thing that happens in any software project. But if you want to say, you know, the number of people that really are sort of the core developers, and if they disappear, that, you know, the other contributors can't sort of continue the project onward, that's really the truck factor, that number of people. And there was a research group in Brazil who wrote a paper where they came up with a little formula, basically, for determining the truck factor based on commit histories. So looking at like how much code has been added, like you know, logical stuff and not just refactorings. And they took the 133 most active projects on GitHub, and with that little formula they had, they determined the amount of information that was concentrated in individual team commits. Individual commits from individual team members, and they calculated what the truck factor was for 133 very popular projects on GitHub. And the horrifying result that they found was that almost 2/3 of projects relied on only 1 or 2 people to survive. So if 1 or 2 people quit and they were strategic, people, the project would basically just die. And I'm not expecting you to read the stuff in this chart. It's more just the trend that you should see. So each row is like a bunch of projects, right? And the TF thing, the thing that's kind of like circled, this is the truck factor. So truck factor 1 has like the most repositories. Truck factor 2 has the second most repositories. And then as the truck factor increases, there are fewer and fewer projects. And these are the 133 most popular projects. And just to help a little bit, I have focused in on some of them. So some projects with truck factor 1 that you might be aware of, Grunt, SAS, D3, if you know any of these things, RX Java, if you use that. Truck factor 2 is Apache Cassandra or Netty. Clojure, if you use Python pandas. Truck factor 2, Drupal, truck factor 2. So you don't want two very specific people in each of these projects to get very pissed off and quit, that would be bad. I don't know if there's other ones on here that you can see. There's Jade. So there's Logstash and Elasticsearch, truck factor 2. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. Oh, yeah, and hilariously, Homebrew is 250 because everybody is a Homebrew contributor. Right, but okay. Yeah, that's not good, right? That's pretty bad. So you could look at this like potential Stephen Henson's in the making here. So if you have any money riding on any of this stuff, you should be worried. But to make like a positive point that follows up, there are projects that have high truck factors as well. So Linux, of course, lots of people are supporting Linux, and lots of people can quit, and Linux will still exist. Other things that you might be familiar with, V8 is not super obvious, but Google has at least 14 people who who can move elsewhere and still keep this thing alive, for example. And there's a website that makes it easy to see these results that this research group put together. It's called gettrends.io, and you can basically just write, put a GitHub repository in here and then see what the truck factor is. The good news is that, like the last time I checked, Scala was like 6, so that's good, right? But if you use anything else, you should check what the truck factor is. I see the type level people here are like furiously typing. Check the type level projects if you use them. If there's a project that doesn't have enough high enough truck factor, you should consider helping those people. Just to give some more points about some more quotes from maintainers that again, this is not the Scala community. This is just in general. A fellow named Noah Kantrowitz, who was a longtime member of the Python Software Foundation, has, I think, a very nice way of kind of summarizing this shift, where you have a large increase in the number of people building their lives and businesses and livelihoods on open source software, but not the same increase in people contributing or building new open source projects. And he writes, in the early days of the open source movement, there were relatively few projects, and in general, most people who were using a project were also contributing back to it in some way. But both of these things have changed by likely uncountable orders of magnitude. There's a growing imbalance between producers and consumers. In the past, these things were roughly imbalanced. Everyone put in time and effort into the commons, and everyone reaped the benefits. These days, very few people put in that time and effort, and the vast majority simply benefit from those who do. This imbalance has become so ingrained that for a company to repay in either time or money, even a small fraction of the value they derive from the commons is almost unthinkable. Because nobody does it, why would your company randomly start doing it, right? More quotes from longtime open source maintainers. This is a guy who, rage quit. But I've got two sort of examples of this. This is Ryan Big, who wrote documentation for Ruby on Rails, and he quit all open source work. And his justification or his rationale was, he doesn't have time or energy to invest in open source anymore, not being paid at all to do any open source work. So the work that I do is time that I could be spending doing life stuff or writing. It's not fair to expect me to do even more work outside of my regular work and then not get fairly compensated for it. It's also a great recipe for burnout and making me just generally very grumpy. David Michael Ross, has another sort of horrifying experience that actually I even know people who had things like this happen to them. He says, okay, that's the big thing for me. It's knowing that you did something for free out of love. And there's an endless stream of people out there going more, more, more and getting angry when you don't accommodate their edge case. I had my phone number on one of my personal websites so friends could get in touch with me. Took it down after a week because people would call me in the middle of the day for plugin support, even though there's a forum for support. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It just wears you down. It makes you afraid to check your email or answer the phone. I mean, I don't know what to say in response to any of these things. It's just I want to point out that there's an issue here. This poor guy was afraid to check his email. Like, I'm not saying it's anybody in this room's fault. I'm just saying, this is bad. These people, we depend on them to make this stuff, and they don't even want to check their email. Okay. And burnout is not a new thing. It happens all the time. And, it's a cute example of this is what burnout looks like, contributor burnout. So on that note, one more horrifying thing I'm going to provide to you. Everybody is doing it, yes, including the Department of Defense in the US. Actually, they were one of the first organizations to jump all over open source, which is perhaps even scarier. A 2003 report showed that the US Department of Defense was already by then a major user of open source software, and they were using it even in mission critical situations. So the Department of Defense, they have like missiles and stuff. At that time, they didn't even know that they depended heavily on open source software. And this report was just to figure out, okay, this thing, open source software exists. Is it good or bad? Do we have some of it in use internally? They discovered, indeed, we have a lot of it in use. Actually, and don't ban it. We need to let's just keep using it. We need more open source. And a quote from the report was, FOSS applications tend to be much lower in cost than their proprietary equivalents, yet they provide high levels of functionality with good user acceptance. So now imagine like another, heartbleed thingy with like a missile system or something in the US government. That's also bad. So, it's not just like cool, trendy startups that are depending on open source and building lots of business and making lots of money on it. It's like, scary government organizations doing it too. So, I start to ask myself, well, is the US government secretly writing software for firing missiles that's built on some sort of open source project where the maintainer is like gonna rage quit? I don't know, that's horrifying. Okay, my intention was only to point out that this is not just companies, it's governments, it's everybody jumping all over this stuff, and we haven't really thought about the weight that we're putting on the people who are keeping these things alive, or how to sustain those people, or to keep these communities of people who are building these things healthy and happy. Okay, just to summarize, using FLOSS or open source software over proprietary is now mainstream. I don't think that's an argument anymore. I think we can all accept that. Startups, enterprises, even governments are depending and deepening their dependency on this digital infrastructure. And that means orders of magnitude more users, and we're not seeing the same growth in the number of people who are keeping these things alive for all of us to depend on. And the worst part of all of this is that nobody seems to know about this, or nobody seems to be aware of all of these things happening. We're aware of it when Heartbleed happens, but that's it. We don't want like lots of Heartbleeds happening. So, all right, how can we reverse this? I don't have an answer for you. If you thought I had an answer for you, you are sadly mistaken. So I will point out, though, that people are looking at funding open source projects. Like, how do we do this in a way that makes sense, that actually translates into useful things happening for all of us? And one thing that has come out of this sort of, people looking at this problem is that, well, turns out that you can't just throw money at it without any sort of coordination, organization, planning. You can't just be like, oh no, Heartbleed, here's $1 million, and expect all problems to go away. That doesn't work. there are lots of things that are the reason for this. One could be that the maintainer, that there might not be any maintainer that can put more hours into a project, even if they're paid more money, because they have a job already and they're not willing to quit their already existing job, maybe. Or the amount of money that you might want to throw at a project is too small to actually make a meaningful impact. For example, let's say you really want a big feature in something and you have a lot of money, you want to throw $1,000 at something. We know how much developers are paid. Good luck trying to find somebody that will like quit their job or whatever for like $1,000 for a week's worth of work or something. It's, sometimes it doesn't work out, even though $1,000 seems like a lot of money. There are more examples. People have tried a lot of different sorts of funding models, and some are successful, some are not. And I would argue that the most common method of open source funding is via some sort of subsidy, and by subsidy, there are two kinds. One is personal labor. So this is the kind that you think of, which is basically I have a day job and I work all my night and weekend hours on open source in my spare time. I am personally donating to this project. The other is corporate labor subsidy, where a company will hire somebody and let them do either a majority of their work or parts of their work on open source projects that they know other companies are using. It's either an explicit allocation or accidentally because your project needs it. And actually the corporate labor one is much less common, but I think that one actually works the best. There are other things that I don't really care to discuss right now, so patronage, which is like people throw some money at it, and then people offering products and services. And there's no answer about what is actually the most sustainable. And if I had to bet any money on this, like this is just my personal opinion, I'm no expert in any of this, but I would argue that corporate patronage is probably the best way that I can think of right now in 2018 to ensure that open source projects continue to exist. This is the example, like, Google works on V8 and we all use V8. Obviously they work on it for strategic reasons, but it's it's an open source project that the company is sort of funding the development on. If you have a company that will just be like, okay, we desperately need project X to exist, we build all of our stuff on it, it would be really cool if we hired a committer to that project at our company, let them work half 50% of the time only on open source stuff for that project. That's another example of something that actually seems to work a little bit. But just to let you know that there are still, it's still not all green pastures if you do this. Actually, I don't know how many people, does anybody here, do you know what your company's policy is towards giving back to open source software? Like, can you raise your hand if you know about it? Yeah. So, I mean, that's also an issue, right? I mean, there's a few people in this room that know that their company even has, like, you don't know if your company has a policy. Maybe they do, you're just not even aware of it if they do have one. And a lot of the time they don't have one at all. So most organizations don't actually have a process for this yet, or they're unaware of one in their organization. And I think this came out of the 2017 survey that I was showing you. 37% of respondents said that there exists a process in their company, 45% said that there exists none at all, and 16% say that they don't even know. So even if there is a process, a lot of people aren't aware of it, and most companies don't have a process. So yeah, what can I tell you? Change has to start somewhere, and the first thing that you need to do to start changing things is just to be aware that things might need to change. I can't tell you what to do. I can just tell you that this is an issue, and if your company doesn't have a policy for dealing with open source, maybe you should ask somebody about it. Does a policy exist? What does it take to create a policy? Do we depend on something that has a truck factor 1? Would it be good if somebody at the company learned how to be a committer on that project so that it doesn't die? Are we will our lawyers let us give back to it? You have to start asking these questions if you want to start trying to solve this problem. And yeah, like I said, not one person solves this problem. It's all of us being slowly made aware that this is an issue. Right. So, I mean, me personally, one thing I care about right now, that doesn't involve a legal department at a company is just teaching people how to participate in open source projects. So that comes back to those open source sprees. If you see a spree popping up anytime around you, you should try to participate in it just to meet other open source contributors if you want to learn how to contribute to open source, etc. And again, you can get one of these cool t-shirts if you do. so it's always a great side effect. Yeah, just to give some examples of what the structure looks like. This is from, I don't remember which spree this was, but this is what you can expect to find in a GitHub README. So there's a number of projects that you'll see, and the person who is responsible for the project that will be at the spree. And usually when you click these links, it will take you to a number of issues that are labeled for the spree. So just a quick example of what it looks like. And here's a bunch of happy people who have participated in an open source spree. And I'm going to end with one more point. Just something that I think is pretty cool that you should know exists. I was talking a little bit about trying to figure out how to fund open source development, and I gave you a list of models that existed. This is a new model, which I think is kind of cool. It's a company called Tidelift, and the idea is that they hope to basically facilitate the exchange of funds relative to open source project usage. So the idea is, okay, if you can, as a company, inform them, I know this is scary, I don't know how they're going to do that, but let's just pretend that's not a problem. You inform them what projects you depend on in your builds. Like, you don't give them access to your source code or anything. You just say, here are my dependencies. And they create relationships with the individual projects that you generally depend on. And the more people that depend on a certain project, they can collect basically it's kind of like watching a video on YouTube. If a video goes viral, you get 1 cent or something per view or whatever, and you can, and then that gets split up or whatever. If something goes viral on YouTube, you can make a little bit of money off of it, right? So if a bunch of people are using a certain project, and this company can determine which things are most dependent on, basically the idea is to come up with I really don't know how, I don't know what to call this, but it's a model for paying people a monthly rate based on the usage of their open source project, basically. So, and the thing that you get as a company who, gets involved with this Tidelift thing is that if you ever have a major issue, a major support problem or whatever, some security issue or whatever, you get notified right away, and you have kind of a direct line to the contributors that keep the thing alive. The idea is, can we find a model that we can pay people a living wage, where we can pay people a living wage to keep open source projects alive, is kind of what their goal is, which is pretty cool. I don't know anything else about this company other than that. I hope their model works. If it does, cool. We have a new model for funding open source. If not, I'm happy they tried. To sort of end everything, to wrap up, I'm going to leave you with one more quote before I take questions. This is a quote from Nadia Eghbal. In the last 5 years, open source infrastructure has become an essential layer of our social fabric, but much like startups or technology itself, what worked for the first 30 years of open source's history won't work moving forward. In order to maintain our pace of progress, we need to invest back into the tools that help us build bigger and better things. So if you recall the first 30 years of open source versus free software versus all of that no longer applies to the sort of landscape that we're in now, and we have to think of something new. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions, and if you remember anything, you forgot everything I said, general, we don't want your money, we want your pull requests, so please start giving pull requests to things. Thank you.
Okay, we got time for maybe 2 questions. So anybody in the audience wants to ask Heather a question?
I know it's early. And you need more coffee, I can tell. You can ask me what my favorite color is.
I've seen that there's a way of funding people like artists and video makers that is a bit of an evolution of the Kickstarter model, Patreon and stuff like that. Have you seen any successful?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about it at all. I mentioned it existed. There's this one model called patronage. So Patron is an example of one of those companies that enables that. The main issue that people regularly write about or report with this is that it's completely unstable. It tries very hard to provide like a base monthly something, but there are only, in software world, there's not very many examples of any developers being meaningfully supported using this model yet. It's not certainly something that is caught on to actually support somebody so that they don't have to like be panhandling for other sources of income. Which, you know, I don't know how many people here contribute a lot to open source, but it will like absorb all of your time if you're really into it. And open source developers, maintainers of open source projects are they have some of the most energetic people I've ever met. I don't know where it comes from, and they put like all of their energy into their open source projects. And I see this a lot more in open source than I do, you know, in closed source sorts of company environments. So, you know, you look at somebody who has zillions and zillions of units of energy that they want to throw into a project. You want to support them and not make them, you know, be panhandling to survive, right? And so, yeah, I guess I'm answering from the perspective of how do we actually completely support them rather than giving them some crumbs. And patronage doesn't work very well for that. So far.
Anyone else? Yep.
I'll steal the mic. So I was thinking, maybe from your point of view, if what do you think about the fact that maybe the whole ecosystem of open source, like meaning how many projects exist and in different repositories, maybe influence how and how much people contribute back? I'm saying that because there are so many projects.
Yeah, if there's too many, like you kind of have like, you're like exhausted, you can't choose which one to even get involved with, right?
Yeah, because I think there's a commitment behind joining a project somehow, so you're going to spend, as you said, a lot of energy into that. So do you think there should be some kind of shift in the...
Like consolidating?
Having fewer but better maintained, and or at least kind of making a difference. What do you think about it?
I think that, I mean, from like organizationally, that sounds like a wonderful way to better organize all of the energy that we have. Like, don't spread it around things that are not going to take off, right? But then how do new things develop? You got to have like a critical mass of people developing things that are not mainstream before they get, you know, they catch on. So I would be careful to discourage people from working on things that are not like the most popular X or Y. However, I would look at it like this. If you're a company, you know you have something that, you know you're using something and it's crucial to your, you know, to your company's infrastructure, whatever you're building, and you don't have anybody on staff that could like commit a fix that will block you, you should maybe consider investing energy in that project as I think the best way to, at least from the perspective of, hey, let's help corporate subsidies. You know, maybe that's not the question that you're asking, but you know, I think this is like the first thing that we can do to try and support the projects that at least we're building companies on. Stuff that we're building things for fun on. I have fewer opinions about how to sustain those because it's less ridiculous than the situation that OpenSSL had to deal with, where you had like umpteen million companies like baking SSL and OpenSSL into something and then selling it for a lot more money and then like leaving this guy to starve. Like, you know, I'm trying to stop that situation. So yeah, like everything that I'm saying is often like biased towards how do we make corporate subsidy work, because somehow I think that's the way forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we had another big round of applause.
Thanks.